Okay, welcome to Working Group API Expression. It's the 23rd of June, and we got one item from Ken on the agenda. Ken, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I, like many of you, work on a number of operator projects in addition to the API machinery and what have you. The different projects, we can include KubeBuilder as well as Operator SDK, have had a number of issues hitting them lately of those developers that have upgraded to 118 as their underlying set of libraries. With respect to generation of CRDs. So we could go through the whys and why nots and things like that, but the core of it is that the X Kubernetes list map keys, which was newly verified and enforced with 118, kind of was ahead of any validation or defaults, if you will, in the core. And so I guess setting the stage, make sure the context is set. Anytime you're creating a CRD that might use existing core types, a validation failure will occur saying that those core types do not have defaults. And the defaults in the core tend to be comments and are managed through code. And so I thought I would start a conversation here, being directed here in a couple of places. I think the last meeting was KubeBuilder. So there's a lot of interest in this. As I read up on it, it appears that there's some defaults that might be easy, things that are static. The failure that, like if someone in a CRD includes container for like an init container or something along those lines, there'll be a failure for ports and a default for protocols. The default, I believe, is TCP. But there's nothing that actually expresses that. I know that there's other defaults that might be determined by a couple of properties, and those might be more challenging to articulate. So I'm just opening up the conversation. I would love to know what to do. I'm more than happy to invest time and energy creating a KEP if that's where we need to go with it.
So I'm just trying to make sure I understand properly. Is this a bug or is this a feature request?
It's a great question. How do you define bug?
No, I know.
What happened is, ideally the timing of these things would be coordinated in some way. And the challenges that you run in computer science in general are when meaningfully positive features intersect in some way. So the things that intersected here and I don't know enough information to know if it was intentionally, if it was thought out, if it was imagined, or whether.
Okay, let me, can I phrase my question differently? Did we break anything?
Depends on what you mean. If somebody creates CRDs that do not use anything other than their own defined types, then there's nothing really broken. Also, okay. What we're also talking about, I believe, is we're talking about something that they might be able to fix on their own. We're talking about code generation. The problem, though, is that with KubeBuilder or with Operator SDK, when the generated CRDs are generated from core types and included in the open API schema for validation in the CRD, they fail. Like there's no way to apply that CRD. It can be modified, and that modification would be overwritten by generation again. And then there's kind of this loop that gets created.
Do you have an issue where we can look at some specific details?
I do.
So what you're talking about is if you define a CRD in KubeBuilder and you use, for example, pod spec in it, that would fail.
Yeah, I'm curious why it does.
It fails because as of Kubernetes 118, there is a requirement that validates here is the issue that was closed that creates this situation.
It looks different.
Kubernetes list map keys are validated with defaults.
Yeah, okay. So it's missing a default, right? That's the problem. We need, in the schema, we need, for example, for the TCP to be noted as the default. That's what you're saying.
Well,
But
short answer is yes, but that is that's one thing out of many, right? Like there's more than that.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah.
Because, I mean, there's a rule that API machinery, we're supposed to actually set the defaults on the server. We're not supposed to have clients set the defaults.
Yeah, but in this case, yeah, but so, yeah, no, I see what's going on. At least for this one, I'm curious about the others. I'd like to, and each of these probably needs to be dealt differently. So
there could be a couple of thoughts here. One is, there were suggestions to just fix this in KubeBuilder or maybe ToolGen, but that doesn't feel like it's the right place.
okay, so let me tell you what we're doing that maybe is gonna help. Jenny is working on making the // plus default that exists in KubeBuilder, this flag specifically. She's making it so that this is gonna work for core types. So we are going to have the core types have the // default and the static default be specified directly there. And so we're going to have the default for the TCP, for example, for the protocol. And this will fix this specific error. Do we agree on that?
Yeah,
I don't
the schema
know
will
about...
now understand what's going on, and so it won't complain.
Yeah, because then we're going to have a default, and so that's going to solve this error.
So that would add it to this OpenAPI schema?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, for this one, it should do it because it's a static default.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, okay, for the map keys, we do believe that they should be required. Technically, I mean, they can have a default, but I think they should always be required. If it's a key, they should be required. We happen to have the protocol being defaulted and being a key for Spec. I think that's sort of unfortunate. So we have to say, okay, it can be either defaulted or required, but we don't have a good way to statically, declaratively say the protocol is defaulted, and that's why this piece of code doesn't realize that there is actually a default for the protocol. But what we need is a good way to say this has a default, use the default for the key.
Yeah, at a first glance, this looks like a fairly edgy case. I mean, I would want to go look and see how many maps have defaults in them for their keys, but my intuition is it's pretty rare.
One. This.
Yeah, if it comes up to be like more than one, I'm going to be a little bit surprised, and if it comes up more than 5, I'm going to be shocked.
Yeah, no, I don't think we know, at least we don't know any other than this one.
Yeah, so because of that, I'm tempted to kind of categorize this more as like, this is a very edgy case and it's a bit of a bug, right? Like, because if you could fix this case and demonstrate that there aren't any others and put in maybe a linter or something to make sure that we never introduce others, then the problem could go away potentially.
Yeah, so eventually we should have the same test as this in the Kubernetes repository, so that when anybody writes a type in Go for the core types, we know if they're creating a list map keys of multiple keys or with a key that is neither defaulted nor required. We should be able to validate that within the Kubernetes type for built-in types. But for that, we need the support for default, and that's exactly what Jenny is doing.
Yeah, is there any mitigation in the short term for this specific one? I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I mean, as Ken said, you can edit the OpenAPI and add the default manually.
Yeah.
Which is not great, but
not great, but in this particular case, it's a well-known default, and it's.
Yeah, I'm surprised nobody ever pinged me on this issue. I'm just learning about this right now.
Yeah. Now, are we seeing a wider? Are we seeing other classes of issues here besides just the map key defaulting that we should also be thinking about?
I mean, in general, if Jenny adds that, we can also use that for documentation stuff, like adding defaults there would be quite helpful to many people, I think.
Yeah, I mean, my intuition is that most of the time, and correct me if I'm wrong in my thinking here, is that if you define an object and you omit default fields, that it should usually be valid, because that is something you can validly send to a server and have it default everything for you. So that, my intuition is that usually should be valid, and I can't really, besides this, I can't really think of any cases where that shouldn't be true.
Ken, do you know about any other example?
Yeah, I was just about to mention that as soon as we saw one of these issues, we started seeing several, but as far as I can recall, they were all based on map keys.
Okay. So it sounds like we know how to solve that. Are you happy with the resolution, Ken?
Yeah, it sounds like it's being worked on. Does that mean there's nothing to do but wait, or?
I think mitigate and wait. Or is anybody actually, I mean, it sounds like once Jenny gets her stuff in, does that actually do everything, Antoine, or is there any kind of details that we need to tie up after that for this specific case?
I can try and think about it,
but so far what I understood was Jenny is adding that to internal types, so you can set static defaults. But this one is not failing because they are sending an object that for a CRD, but they are applying the CRD, and the CRD validation says this CRD is invalid.
Yeah, if I understand right here, what we're expecting CRD validation, which is schema-based validation, to pass, which is kind of like the same thing you could do on a client, right? You could take the Open API spec and validate an object against it. And what we're saying is there's an object what we believe is be valid because one of the map keys is going to be defaulted. So that's typically valid, but if you look at it from an API perspective, it's no longer valid.
Yeah, and just to be clear, what's happening is someone's literally trying to apply this manifest, right? And there's a failure at the client side.
But if the Open API spec did know about the default, then this first error can't happen. Just if you just read the error, like intuitively, it makes sense that that would never happen.
What is the last error we can see?
Because
there is one more, but it's the embedded resource. Required value must be empty if embedded resource is true. I don't even know what embedded resource is.
I haven't seen that before either.
We should definitely make sure we CC Jenny on this and have her kind of include it in the cases she tests.
Yeah, that'd be great. Is there any way to follow the work she's doing? Is that an open issue or something?
She's working on changing the cap. She's going to send a cap update so that we know how to do that.
Yeah, that's great.
But okay, yeah, all of this is super interesting and super useful. Thank you, Ken, for coming and raising the bar. Very useful.
Yeah, because everybody's going to hit this, right? Like it's in a core type that everybody uses.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we thought about this, we thought, okay, well, so if you use server-side apply, it means that people are going to have to specify the protocol, which is annoying, but not the end of the world. But we didn't think this was going to prevent people from creating CRDs.
So, but just thinking about like the severity of this, like this is a regression, right?
Yes.
Because it got yeah, so people that had behavior that worked in 117, that regressed in 118. Does that mean that we should be considering a targeted mitigation in API machinery?
Okay,
Is that
so
even feasible?
I don't know. I would suspect this still works, but the problem is it doesn't create a structural schema, or do you get your CRD completely rejected?
The CRD is rejected completely unless you force no validation.
I see. Oh, I see.
And
Okay.
and to Joe's point, these are CRDs that worked and now fail. So
Yeah, so it
Okay.
is a regression.
It's breaking. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think, would you CC me on it too? And I don't know, I just feel like I want to, if there is, I don't have an idea on how to mitigate it yet, but if there was like a source code mitigation that we could do and backport to 118, that might,
I'm going to ask
it's such a core use, right? Like so many CRDs, especially people using KubeBuilder, are going to drop a pod template or a pod spec, and it seems like this is pretty serious.
Yeah, we're seeing failures on Helm, OpenSDK, and KubeBuilder. All of those are
okay. Yeah, so I think you're just the hero most willing to come up and champion this as being a problem, and there's a bunch of other people that are silently yelling at their computers right now.
I'm not sure how this came to be, but yeah, it's something that was seemed.
Yeah, I'm kind of worried about that.
Attention.
Okay, well, thank you for bringing it to us.
All right. Mike added some more stuff.
Yes. So I'm sorry. Last time when I started a discussion about managed fields and it just got away from me, so I just responded. But we wanted a concrete example to work on, so I went and found one. Let's see. So I just took a couple examples and just looked at them, and I found cases where again there was the dot, empty curly brackets, and then everything below it was also specified. And it seems to me that's just unnecessary. If you say dot curly, that means everything below it. There's no need to also go ahead and say everything below it. List out all the things below it.
Yeah, so doesn't it mean you're going to own defaults?
I don't know. Look, what I'm saying is look at what's actually in the managed fields. I don't care how it got there, but we know how it got there, right? You would put stuff in there if it was specified. So we're not talking about defaulted fields here. I'm saying there are examples where the fields are all specified. All of the fields are specified. So nobody's even talking about defaults here.
Sure, but okay. So you apply, let's say we have a structure that has field A and field B, and you apply field A.
No, my example is a structure with fields A, B, C, and D, and A, B, C, and D were supplied. There's no defaulting happened.
Okay, so if no defaulting happens, then yes, I agree with you.
And if there's no mapper list items, right? Because that doesn't that also create an ambiguity
I'm
where, like,
talking about a struct, okay? It was looking at a condition, okay? A condition in a status where there's a dot empty curlies for the whole condition, and then there's an entry for every field in the condition. Every field, none was defaulted.
Yeah, in this case, we can do something.
Now, my next question is, did you think you were already doing that, or is this like a new idea?
We didn't think we were doing that. We haven't tried to optimize that.
Yeah, I remember like one of us asked, I think Daniel or something, and one of his observations was that there are enough defaults and maps and lists in practice that he was skeptical how much actual benefit you might get from it. Not that it's not right, it is right, but the urgency and the actual in practice benefit, I think he was questioning. I'm not totally sure I have a good enough understanding of the types to have a say on that, but I'm certainly at least something to think about here is like, yeah, it's right, and I don't think I would stop anybody from doing it, but you got to make sure you only do it in the cases where you're absolutely sure, and then it might actually have less of an impact than we hope for.
I agree with his skepticism, but I mean, these things are so verbose. It seems to me we should be doing everything we can to minimize them, because it's just crazy what's there now.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
All right.
But we have limited resources, so.
Yeah, maybe my statement is more of like, this is the background of why people didn't do it very urgently at the beginning, more than like why we should make a decision now.
All right. So maybe we should move on to my second item then. I'm a little bit surprised, well, maybe more than a little bit surprised. I'm actually concerned about the way you guys seem to be thinking about equating defaulting with not care, right? I mean, and this goes again back to Daniel's comment. If I look at pod spec, for example, there's a lot of stuff, and every release there's more. Usually, in fact, right, the idea, the way it has been, is a developer looks at these things and figures out what he has to specify in order to get what he wants. Okay, so for example, in a pod spec, if the developer wants the default service account, he leaves it unspecified. If the developer wants the default value for host network, he leaves it unspecified. If the developer wants the default pod security policy, he leaves it unspecified. It goes on and on and on. You guys seem to be saying that if I want the default security account, I have to actually write it in. If I want the default value for host networking, I have to actually write it in, and on and on and on. Okay, you're actually imposing a big new burden on developers. My focus is on people writing controllers. You guys seem to be thinking maybe of people using kube control, but it's a burden on them too.
Yeah, I think that's mostly right and correct. Yeah, I completely understand with your point. Another good example would be that most people specify the port 80, for example, and no one specifies TCP. Because
exactly. We were just talking about that, right? They know the default is TCP, and so they just leave it unspecified because they know it's going to do what they want anyway.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
But that's actually a relatively easy example because that's one small thing.
And so what are you saying? We can think about the implications of that. What are you suggesting?
I'm thinking maybe you need to think about a more radically different formulation, adding some, kind of explicit declaration of what I care about or something like that. Because inferring it from what's specified is just making a logical mistake here. It's just not true that developers actually write down everything they care about.
Do you want a new semantic to say, I care about these? Why would people specify things that they don't care about? So I'm a little confused.
I'm sorry. We could optimize it, saying, here are the additional things that I care about that I didn't bother to specify. So we can infer the things that are written down that are specified. The question is, things that are not written down, we don't really know whether you care about or not. I think it's incorrect to infer that the developer doesn't care about them.
So brought to our current system, you want to specify which fields you want to own but didn't specify?
That's what I mean, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Now, even that has a problem still, because when, for example, as development happens in future releases, fields are added typically that have semantics that engage additional functionality. And it's actually probably a little difficult to know, whether the developer for release X wanted functionality that's introduced in release Y or not, wanted the absence of this functionality or didn't care about it. But I would say the most likely conclusion is that he didn't want it because he knew he wasn't getting it.
Yeah. I'm not sure I understand this point as well as the previous point. But I'm still a little bit focused on the first point. Sorry about that. It's difficult for me to switch. I'm still thinking that if we want people to specify the port and they do care about the protocol, wouldn't it be awkward for them to specify somehow that they care about the protocol without having to actually type the value for the protocol?
Yes, actually, I agree. I'm not actually sure this is the best suggestion. I'm just saying I'm pretty confident that inferring that the developer or author, whether it's a person or a controller, inferring that it doesn't want to own something that wasn't specified, I really think that's incorrect. What is the best solution? I'm not sure, but I'm really dubious of the existing inference.
Are these coming from problems that you've had while using the feature? The feature?
No, I haven't been using this feature. I'm just
Okay.
trying to think through how it's going to be working for me.
No, yeah. Thank you for doing that. I'm just curious how these
the situation to talk about, is it common to only care about a single or a small set of defaults, or all defaults? Like, does the controller care about all defaults? Or because if it's all, it might be an option to just say, I care about all defaults I send, and we can take care of all of them, and you don't have to specify each one.
Right, that might be a useful abbreviation. Yeah, that's a good hypothesis. I'm not sure how to answer it. So again, thinking about the pod, right? I mean, for example, just think about the replica set controller, right?
Yeah.
It is propagating the pod spec from the replica set spec into the pod object, and it kind of wants to propagate that. In some sense, its job is a middleman. So, it's getting a pod spec from someone else, maybe a deployment controller, maybe a person running kubectl. It's a kind of interesting question here about this. So, I mean, just thinking through examples, right? So, for example, a person uses kubectl to submit a deployment object that has a set of containers and no init containers. And in this cluster, Istio is deployed, and Istio adds an init container, right? Is that a contradiction or not? Because the person who wrote the deployment said he didn't want any init containers, but he's willing to let the cluster add, whatever gets added for Istio, or maybe there's other systems like it that add in init containers, or maybe sidecar containers that run. I've seen other systems that add sidecar containers that are not init containers. I'm sorry, that's right. Istio is not init; it's a sidecar, right? So I've seen various systems that add sidecar containers, right?
Yeah.
And that's not a contradiction, but in some sense, it's also, the author doesn't expect random stuff added, but he's willing to accept what's kind of built into the cluster.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Is that a problem though?
I'm not sure, but you have to get the semantics right. So it's not like this is a list, right? So but it's a list that's a map, right? Really, it's a map from name to all the other properties. Actually, or is it marked as an atomic list, or is it marked as a map?
No, it's not atomic. Yeah, it's an associative list.
Yeah, it's a map. Okay. Right. So I guess maybe the way to think of it is for maps, what you're saying is that the author is not taking ownership of all the keys that he didn't specify, and that's acceptable. It doesn't say everything that might want to be said, but that's good enough. Again, my concern is more of things like the pod spec, which is a big struct, where the developer, looks at it and says, these are the fields I need to specify to get what I want, and I can ignore all these others because the default gives me what I want.
Yes. No, I agree with that. So one way we could maybe address that would be to assume that you want to own all the defaults. And I mean, we could totally do that.
That might be right. Maybe the right approach is for a struct, the guy who submits it owns all the defaults. For a map, he doesn't own the keys that he didn't mention.
There's a difficulty with owning defaults, which is that if a new field is added, it may have a default. In fact, it's required to have a default, and users probably shouldn't own those things since they won't be present in the user's manifest, right?
Well, I would argue that if a new field is added, presumably it is for the purpose of introducing optional new behavior, and the default value signals I want the old unextended behavior, and that is what the user actually wanted.
So there's a problem with that in that you can introduce a new field in two versions simultaneously, and those versions can have different defaults. So which default the user would own depends on which version you would interpret it in.
Well, slow down here. I'm not sure I understand your premise. You talked about introducing.
Yeah, when you introduce a new field, if there's multiple versions of an API type, one common reason actually for introducing multiple versions is so that you can let a field have a distinct default in each version. Hold on, my bread is burning. 1 second.
Priorities.
Yeah, different versions can have different defaults. But I don't think I agree with you, Mike, because they would not make a new variable default to I want this feature enabled, and it didn't exist before.
So first off, I will admit I haven't thought through all the multi-version issues, but what I see is that these objects get recorded in one version. So the default that matters is the default in that version.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
I want to wait for Daniel to get back.
Yeah.
And even in a single
no, that's
version,
not correct. The default that it is not the case that you get the default recorded in. Is it the case?
Well, slow down. That's not what I said. So what I said is that by the time an object gets stored, it is stored in one version. And so one place to start thinking is thinking about the default value or the value.
Yeah, I can't.
In that version.
On the read path, we supply a default, and I'm having a brain lapse. I can't recall if we supply the default from the storage version or from the version that is being read.
No, if you apply in a specific version, we're going to use the defaults for that specific
Right,
version.
right. But part of the reason why we want API server to do the defaulting in the first place is that we do the defaulting on the read path, not just the write path.
Oh yeah, right. You mean also when we read the object from the database?
Yeah, when you read the object and a field has been added since the object was written, if the field has a default value, then we have to supply that default value.
That's very weird though.
Well, it's not going to change.
So if you read from the database, it depends on the version of this. Okay, I see what you're saying. That's very odd.
I can't recall if it depends on the version of the object of the storage version or if it depends on the read version.
I would
think it
expect
has to
the
depend on
answer-
the storage version.
Yes, right. We do a read using the storage version and then a conversion to the version that the client requested.
That's what I would expect. But unwinding the stack, I really think a user should own exactly the fields that are present in their manifest and no others, right? Because the user is making a declaration about those fields. They're not making a declaration about any other field. So I don't think we should give the user fields that they don't explicitly mention.
Well, I think that logic, I mean, as a developer, I'm telling you that's not true. I look at the definitions and figure out what fields I need to specify in order to get what I want, and figure out which fields I can leave, empty, because I know that the default is what I want.
But the defaults can change from version to version. So even if you like the default and you depend on the default, you should probably own that field. If you don't care, then you shouldn't mention the field.
I expect the defaults to semantically be stable. So I expect that the things that I let default, well, first off, I'm writing in a particular version, right? When I write a client, it's declaring in a particular version. And I expect that if there are any changes to that version in the future, I expect them to be semantically continuous so that my old client continues to be doing the right thing. Right? Otherwise, we've broken backwards compatibility.
Yeah.
So that break down?
So okay, here's an example where this doesn't work at all. The replicas field of a deployment has a default, and the default is 1. If I submit a manifest without specifying that field, and I own that field, and I own the fact that the field has a value of 1, I create a conflict with other parts of the system, right? That's right, like I would have a conflict with HPA. The next time I went and submitted my thing, if HPA has clobbered that number, I would get a conflict. And it would be a very mysterious conflict because that field wouldn't even appear in my manifest. So like, why are you giving me a conflict over a field that I haven't even mentioned? So I really think it's actually quite important that we do not give people ownership of fields that they haven't specified in their manifest.
I agree that if we simply give ownership to everything in a struct, that's going to stop the HPA from working. On the other hand, I also think that it is so in the example of HPA, right? The author, I would argue that HPA is incorrect to apply to a deployment where the author is unwilling to have its replica count changed. It's only correct to apply HPA if the author is willing to have the replica count changed. So I think that this is a case where the author does does explicitly want to not own a particular field. But I think there are lots of other cases where the author does have an opinion, and the opinion is that the default value is exactly what I want.
Okay, you muted.
Oh, sorry. Owning the field is not about whether you like the value or not. It's about whether you own the fact that the value is what it is and not some other agent in the system, right? If you don't
Yes,
mention the
agreed.
default, you're explicitly saying, I don't want to own this field. I would actually like some other part of the system to own this field. And in fact, if something else in the system decides that there's a better value for this field, I'd be happy to have them help me.
And this is what I'm disagreeing with. I understand that's the current definition that this group is working with. I'm just saying I don't believe it. I'm telling you, as a developer, I look at the definitions, and in cases, there's plenty of cases where I look and say, what's the default? What's this field mean? What's the default? Yes, that's the value I want. I will leave it unspecified because I know it's going to give me what I want, and I want what the default is. I don't want somebody changing it. I agree with you that in the case of HPA, that's not what's going on, but I do believe that in other cases, there are plenty of other cases where that is what's going on.
So one option that probably isn't pretty and won't work for apply as we have it right now is setting you as the owner of those fields in the managed fields. Would that work?
I don't think that will. I mean, it would be very strange because the next time a user sends this manifest, there'll be a bunch of fields that in theory the user owns, but they've omitted. So we're going to go through the deletion path.
And yeah, we prune them. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Why?
So
why are they being
I
pruned?
don't understand how this can work.
Well, I think if they're being
you-
pruned, it's again under the assumption that I'm challenging.
The pruning is we remove managed fields you didn't specify in your apply, but you previously applied, I think. And what Daniel mentioned is if you apply fields and you don't apply them the second time, we remove it. We treat them as you remove those fields.
That's fine.
Let me add another argument, which is if the user does not want to own a defaulted field, if we give them all defaulted fields, there is suddenly no way to express the fact that you do not wish to own a field, right?
Unless we introduce one. Yes, I agree.
But we already have the convention that you own the fields that you've mentioned and not other fields.
And right, I'm saying I have a problem with that convention because there's plenty of cases where I want the default value. I don't want a different value.
But do you? I think if this, okay, so if the system is choosing the default and you're happy with that and you don't specify it in your manifest, what goes wrong? I don't think anything goes wrong, right? You haven't mentioned it, but the system isn't going to randomly change unless something else comes in and changes it. Now, if that something else is a controller, it's going to ignore conflicts and change it anyway. So you owning the field doesn't help.
Well, slow down. Help me understand that latter point. You said controllers going to change it anyway?
Yeah, controllers do not get conflicts. Controllers can set fields however they want. Because we assume it's not useful to give controllers a conflict error. It's not useful because a controller isn't going to do anything with that message, right? Like it can't. It's a semantic message. The controller doesn't understand that. So the controller, the policy is the controller always forces conflicts. And then the next time the user attempts to apply, the user gets an error because the user will understand the error and know what to do with that. From this perspective, whether a user owns a default field or not doesn't actually change the system behavior. In that controllers will still feel free to clobber the value, and then the user will get a conflict next time.
Yeah, I have a counterpoint for that. Sorry. What if you
Sure.
wanted, you assume the default was what you wanted, and so you didn't specify it. You're not going to get a conflict even though it changed. So if I wanted replicas equal 1 and I saw that the default is 1, so I didn't care to specify it, and then I reapply, I'm not going to get a conflict even if something else has changed it to 100.
Maybe it's a question of the default definition. Is it a default, like it will be set in the object, which doesn't seem like to be, or is it just the default system behavior and the system can do anything on basis of this default?
Yes.
Antoine, I think that's not what would happen. I think if we were to implement what Mike is suggesting, the way it would work is our first step before we go through the apply logic is to expand the user's manifest with all the default fields that they didn't specify.
Yeah.
We would have to do that first. Otherwise we'll go through the delete path a bunch of times when we
no, I agree. I completely agree. But if we did that, then you would
so if we
see
expand with the default, then any field that you don't mention, which is not its default value, will give you a conflict, and that would be true for any user in the system.
I don't disagree. Yeah.
Which that doesn't seem right at all.
You would get a conflict for replicas, but you would also get a conflict for many other fields.
Yeah, any user owning a defaulted field but setting it to a non-default value would generate a conflict for any other applier of the object who doesn't mention that field. That doesn't seem right at all.
No, I agree, but you understand my point. We don't have a way to say that I care about a specific default. Oh, yes, we do. Specify the default.
Yes, we do. You specify it in your manifest, and then you own it and nobody else does.
So if you specify, you say, I care about this explicit default value, and if you don't specify it, you're more saying, I'm leaving this to the system to default in its way.
Yeah, maybe another way of describing it is, you put the fields in your manifest if you want a conflict if some other actor in the system changes that field value.
But not if that actor is a controller.
No, if the actor is a controller or the actor is something else. The controller doesn't get a conflict. You get the conflict. The subsequent time that you apply.
So, again, I spend most of my time thinking about controllers, and in the controllers I've written, again, I cruise through the object type definitions, figure out what the controller needs to specify, and in cases where the default is what the controller wants, my controller doesn't specify it.
Well, wait.
So how does no, that doesn't seem right at all. How do you know that some other actor? What happens if somebody else clobbers the field in the object? Your controller doesn't put it back?
My controllers will typically react to changes to objects and redecide what they want to do. And if they're not happy with anything about them, they'll change it again.
Okay, so the controller will reset a field to its default if somebody else changes it.
Yes.
That sounds more imperative than declarative, though.
I mean, if it works, it works. I mean, it would be simpler to like reapply with forced conflicts the set of fields that you care about. Then you don't really even have to pay too much attention to whether somebody's clobbered it or not.
Well, usually the objects I write are complicated enough that, it's not, I just leave it to the, I just write the logic once to figure out what to do and not try to optimize anything else. Because typically.
Yeah, that's fine. The system will actually, it shouldn't, like if you send a no-op change, the system is intended to not actually add in a necessary write. So. Yeah, that's
well,
fine.
My controllers will typically not submit a no-op change, but my point is that the logic for figuring out what should be what they should be writing. Typically one object depends on several objects, in complicated ways. And I typically will only go so far as to write down that logic and not, optimize, special paths for, precluding or shortcutting or preventing anything else. I just let that logic runs whenever anything relevant changed.
How does your controller figure out that a field is no longer set to the default you want it to be?
Well, what it's describing is a logic that says something like, whenever any relevant object changes, put an object reference in the work queue. And when it's time to work on an object reference, look up, read the values of that object and all the related objects, apply the logic that, well, for each of the, in general, this thing can be writing to multiple objects, but for all the objects that this thing might be writing to, run the general logic to read, all the related objects and deduce, what should be written. And in the end, if that's what's already there, then don't bother to write. And if it's different from what's already there, then submit the write.
I think there might be some confusion because like I don't know what your controller is, but imagine it's like imagine it's the deployment controller, okay, where it's writing replica sets, and like this controller is watching the deployment object for changes that cause it to need to update the replica set. You can imagine it might also be watching the replica set objects to see if a user changes them in a way that would make them stop matching the deployment. But you could also imagine it not doing that. That's the path that that at least I was trying to talk about.
Right. And I think in this case, I can understand, that is an optimization to say that I know that I am the sole author of these replica sets and no one else is going to be changing them. And so I just write them when I need to write them, and that's the end. And by the way, this cool new feature where I can actually prevent others from writing them. So
it's not a cool new feature to prevent others from writing them. It is a mechanism for warning other humans, and
that they shouldn't write them.
Yeah, well, it's also more like, even if you do write it, I'm probably going to come back and clobber it. So you're just
or maybe not. I mean, in the example you cited, where the deployment controller does not monitor the replica sets, if the user modifies the replica set, the controller is not going to modify it, in response to that, right? It'll only change it at some random time in the future when it has some other reason to change it.
So part of the value of stating which fields you manage is like signaling to the rest of the system about which fields you're going to fight over, because you can imagine, like, I don't think this would be a good design, but just imagine that somebody writes an automatic resource setter, and that works on the replica sets, right?
Resource setter?
Yeah, it sets like the request limit or something.
Okay.
Like the CPU.
That kind of resource. Limit. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
As opposed to our other kind of resource.
Yeah. Sorry. So now there's two possible opinions about this. One, the user could have put it in the deployment spec, or two, this other system could compute what would be a good value and attempt to write that directly into the replica set.
Yes.
We can imagine this is for a defaulted value or something. I think it should be the case that the deployment should indicate whether or not it's going to fight over that field by whether or not it it claims ownership of it in the replica set managed fields, right? Like if a user entered a specific spec, I'd expect a specific CPU limit, for example. I'd expect that to show up in the replica set pod template as owned by the deployment manager, right? Because deployment manager, if it touches that replica set, is likely to set it back to that value.
What about the service account?
Yeah, service account could be the same thing, right? Like
really?
Yeah, you could specify it specifically in your pod template, or you can leave it unspecified.
Yeah, and since I have to also manage the RBAC entries, when I leave it unspecified, I know it's going to get the default service account of the namespace, and I really want that one because that's the one that I've authorized in RBAC. I don't want a different one.
Yeah, I'd actually say if you're gonna manage your RBAC, like you should specifically declare it. If you're going to give permissions to the default namespace, you should also explicitly say, I want the default service account. I usually make service accounts when I want to set permissions, just because I don't like depending on these hidden values. In practice, we're never going to change that behavior, so it's not going to break.
Yeah, I mean that's just the beginning of it, right? I mean, there's also this stuff about pod security policies, and that's gotten more complicated from one release to another. And I would argue that the developers, users, as well as controller writers, right? They want, I would say, the semantics that they're getting, right? They don't want something else coming in and modifying that semantically, even though from one release to another, the syntactic expression changes.
Yeah, so I think there's several somewhat related problems, and one of those problems that we haven't yet focused a great deal of attention on is actually modifying our API to make it more natural for users to get the right behavior.
Yeah, and that's the bigger picture of this, or the bigger mission of this group. So maybe we're out of time now, but maybe we should just take that as, let's again go back to the broader mission of this group and think about what the real challenge here is, and with the full breadth of the mission here. Yeah,
I think we probably can think about defaults in that light. I don't think we can add them to the managed fields like this, but I can imagine something else, like a user tool that expands your manifest. Like you push a button and it fills in the defaults for you, or maybe when you run the apply command, it could offer to do that, offer to mutate your manifest with the defaults.
And again, I keep looking at this from the other side as well. When I'm running a controller, I need something that works for controller authors as well.
Yeah, it'd be nice if it happened in your IDE, right? Like you're editing. Oh, it looks like you're editing a deployment Kubernetes API object. Right. Would you like the defaults filled in? Or show a diff maybe. These are the possible defaults. Which of these?
And again, it also has to work as we evolve these things over time. So anyway, we're out of time for now. But let's think about this with the appropriately broad hat on.
Yeah, sounds good. All right.
Right. Thanks. It was a good discussion. We can go over the task we have. It's like we need to.
Okay, drop.
All right. Bye.
See ya.